Hi, welcome to the Painter's Compass. I'm Glenn Kessler, founder and director of the Compass Atelier. Today I'd like to talk to you about mediums. For oil painters, mediums are the addition of oils or solvents or anything else that we can add into the paint to add transparency and alter drying time, glossiness, and oil content. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that would work, why you would want to do something with the medium, and some of the rules, actual chemical rules that govern the process. To start with, let's look at a cross-section of an oil paint film. So if we think about oil paint as pigment, the dry stuff that provides the color, this would be ivory black, that's burnt bones, burnt umber, burnt sienna, which is heated up dirt, basically, or all the way to chemicals produced in a laboratory, like dioxazine purple or phthalocyanine blue. What we see is that we have that dry dust that provides the color, but we have to suspend it in a medium or binder. For oil painters, that's going to be primarily linseed oil. So this cross-section illustrates the dots being the pigment, providing the color, and the oil being everything else that creates the film. So when we were to look, if we were kind of looking down at this piece of paint, our eye would see, let's say it was blue. We'd see blue molecule and that would reflect back up into our eye. Maybe we look down here and we get all the way down to this blue molecule. We can't get through to the bottom where, a white canvas might be. So we're really seeing an opaque blue. But if we add a little extra medium, which is usually clear, what we're going to see is we're going to disperse those pigment molecules amidst more and more liquid. Now, if we look down, sometimes we're going to hit blue, but other times we're going to be able to look all the way down and see the white underneath. The result would appear to be a transparency or a translucency to that blue. Now, we have different types of mediums that we can work with. Not all mediums are created equal. So if we think about mediums as broken up into three main categories, and there are many others, but these are the three main ones that oil painters will probably be working with. What we have are oils, we have alkyds, and we have solvents. Now, under oils, we'd have things like, obviously, the linseed oil. That is the original binder for our paint. Comes in refined linseed oil, cold pressed linseed oil. There's even stand oil, which is a much thicker viscosity, almost like a honey thickness. It's a slightly polymerized linseed oil still. We have other things here like walnut oil, safflower, sunflower, poppy, and so on. So any of these oils, if we add them into the paint, that's going to extend the pigments between more and more of that binder. But there are also some other properties that we'll get to in just a second that we want to consider. Now we have alkyds as well. Alkyds, more commonly, the Gamblin version is called Galkyd, Gamblin Alkyd, so that's an easy one. Winsor & Newton was one of the first on the market with their product Liquin. And every brand has some variation on it. It's kind of like an emulsion almost. It's a half oil, half water-based kind of a pigment. So that's a medium that we can use for some different purposes. But again, it's going to stretch those molecules. Finally, we have solvent down here. Again, Gamsol is Gamblin's solvent. We have things like Turpenoid from Weber Company, or just plain old turpentine, or odorless mineral spirits. All of those come under the solvent heading. Now we're going to think about three different variables that are in play when you choose your medium, and these really will help you to dictate which medium you want. Probably some of these are already intuitive to you, but let's really look at them. The first is going to be what we call the oil content. This is how much oil is present in the medium. Well, obviously, our oils are 100% oil content. That's all that they are. We're going to add one more thing in just at this moment right here. We're going to add the oil paint itself. This is when you squeeze it out of the tube, how much oil is already in there. Now this is going to be a range based on whether you have a drier paint or a wetter paint. Some pigments want to bond with more oil and some want to bond with less oil. You might even know that based on how long they take to dry or how shiny they are when you squeeze them out of the tube. Your earth tones tend to be quicker dryers. They will come out a little less glossy, so your earth tones, burnt umber, burnt sienna, raw umber, raw sienna, things like that. Whereas your more modern pigments, those chemical pigments like phthalo blue, phthalo green, tend to be a little bit wetter. They require a little bit more oil. So the oil content is a little bit of a range there, with the glossier ones being a higher oil content and the matte ones, those earth tones, being a little lower content. There are exceptions, of course, there. But let's nominally call the oil paint 75% for the purpose of this discussion. It's really a range of, maybe as low as 60 up to 80, 85. But let's just call it 75 so that we can have one number to play with as we work today. Our alkyds, because they're that halfway between oil and water, they're going to be around 50%. Again, these are a range. I know Galkyd is actually 55%, but other Galkyd derivations, their gel and their slow dry, run a range from 40 to 50 to 55. So we'll call that 50. And finally, solvents. Solvents have no oil content whatsoever. They're very good at destroying the bonds that hold the oil paint together, and that's of course why they're used so much to clean your brushes or other surfaces at the end of the day or the painting process. So those are 0%. We're going to come back to oil content in just a moment and explain why that's so important, but it has to do with what's called the rule of fat over lean. Get there in just a moment. Our second quality that we're looking for when choosing a medium is going to be the drying time. And what I like to apply is just the rule of twos, keeps it easy to remember. There is going to be, of course, some range here, but it just illustrates the real range of drying times that we have from all these different mediums. The oils themselves, if you just left them out to dry, it would take about 2 weeks for them to really solidify and get to that solid drying time. So we'll call that 2 weeks. Oil paint, if you just leave your oil paint exposed to oxygen, it's going to take about 2 days to dry. The alkyds, much faster, about 2 hours. And your solvents, about 2 minutes. Again, that's just a kind of a guideline. Those aren't exact numbers. You can't flip a switch from wet to dry. They go through a slow drying process. But this just gives us a sense of, boy, there is really a range. When we're using solvents, they're quick dryers, and when we're using oils, they're much slower dryers. So that could be a variable you're controlling in your painting. And the final quality that we want to look at is the glossiness. The oils have the highest level of gloss, so those are going to be the most glossy. And the solvents are going to have a matte finish, with the oil paints and the alkyds somewhere in between with a satin finish. And that can be annoying if you're noticing differences in the glossiness, but never fear, if you just wait until your painting has been dried, ideally for 4 to 6 months, you can lay Damar varnish on top of it. There are some products that are available on the market that say that they can do that a little faster. You could always use a retouch varnish if you needed to get it into a show and wanted it to look as if it was varnished, but it's not a permanent varnish. A retouch varnish can go on much sooner, and the varnish will kind of fade away a little bit after a couple of weeks or even months. A regular varnish, after you wait 4 to 6 months, that's a permanent thing. Homogenizes gloss, makes the image look nice and clean. So this one we want to know about, but we're not going to let that really control our process. Most of the time we're choosing based on drying time. We want a thinner paint for any number of reasons, to be able to see through transparency or just get a little more fluidity with our paint. And we're thinking about that drying time. Am I a painter who needs the paint to dry from one day to the next? I want to speed up the drying time with an alkyd or even some solvent. Or am I a painter who wants to make it feel like one long extended day over multiple days, so I can work wet into wet? I'm going to be using more oils. But this oil content is absolutely crucially important to understand, because what this corresponds to is the rule of fat over lean, which is actually chemical process. We can't wish this one away or kind of deviate from it and hope that things are going to turn out okay. Oil content, if you don't have an increasing level of oil content in every successive layer, at least maintaining, if not exceeding, the previous layer's number, then you can have layer adhesion issues, you can have cracking, you can have beating up of the paint, or in some very extreme cases, and I've seen this, you can have complete fugitive layers that will fall off the canvas. You want to make sure that that you're following the rule of fat over lean. And let me just clarify it, because a lot of instruction I know out there in academia and at the community level is maybe misinterpreting the rule of fat over lean, and they're telling folks that it's the rule of kind of thick paint over thin paint. Well, that can end up being true in the rule of fat over lean, but that's not really in the spirit of the term. The choice of the word fat over lean is meant to correspond to oil. This is an ancient word. It's a 600-year-old term, from the dawn of oil painting, when people were much more connected to the materiality of their paints and understood that the fat and the oil were the same thing. Ever cooked up a hamburger? You know that when you render that fat under heat, it turns into oil. Of course, these are all plant-based oils we work with, but the idea is still the same. It's more oil every successive layer over less oil. So what we want to make sure is that if we're starting with pure oil paint in our first layer, nice direct painting method, trying to cover that canvas with opaque paint, that then you cannot add only solvent or only alkyd to your paint in successive layers. Again, this is after a layer has dried, so if you're still working wet into wet, then that's one layer. But if the layer of the oil paint that you put on first at 75% has dried, and you go back a couple of days or a week later and you put another layer on, you shouldn't mix in solvent or alkyd into your paint, because that would cause that 75 to drop. You'd be ending up putting on a 60s or a 30s, 40s oil content paint over top of a 75. You'd get cracking. That wouldn't show up immediately. Bubbling up of the paint kind of shows up immediately. That's a little bit of a sign that you might have violated the rule of fat over lean. That does happen sometimes even when you are abiding by the rules of fat over lean. But cracking would show up any time from a couple of days to a couple of months after. And again, I've seen this happen, on student work and my own work, even when I was experimenting and trying things out and just making deals with the devil to get a painting dried up real quick, and then that cracking shows up later. So if you laid on 75% in your first layer, your next layers would have to have a little bit of oil mixed into them. That's 100, so that's pulling it up. Or don't forget, we can mix together mediums to create new oil contents. So if you mix together equal parts of an oil and an alkyd, one at 100% and one at 50%, that medium would be 75%. So you could use that 75% medium mixed into the 75% oil paint to at least maintain 75% oil content while you're adding those layers. You can usually get away with about 3 to 4 layers at the same oil content before you start having some adhesion issues and cracking issues. After that, you want to tick up just a little higher, add just a little more oil into that oil and alkyd mixture. Of course, you can use solvent and oil, and the proportions will matter. If you have 4 times as much oil as you have solvent, just do the math on that, you'd end up with an 80% medium, because you'd have 4 out of the 5 parts are 100%, and one of those parts is 0. So you'd have 4 fifths of 100%, if that makes sense. And you can even mix up mediums before you get started painting. Have different jars. One that would be a lean medium, one a medium, and one that would be kind of a fat medium, or you could write the percentage on the sides of those jars. And just know, day 1, day 2, day 3, I can use this medium. Day 4, day 5, day 6, I want to tick up to the next one. So I hope that helps to clarify about the rule of fat over lean, and a little bit about oil content, drying time, glossiness as it relates to mediums. Happy painting.